Richard Foster from Foster Infrastructure here. Last week I was in Bangladesh overseeing some certified PPP practitioner training, and so this week I am back at my home in Australia and spending my 14 days in post-travel self-quarantine. This has given me some time to think about public-private partnerships in a pandemic situation. Before I get into the details though, I think it's useful to step back and just for a moment think about what are some of the key principles of crisis management that apply in pretty much any field. The number one principle in crisis management is that human life and safety must come first. Good crisis management also requires transparency, accountability, and very strong communication planning and activation of communication activities. With that background, let's think for a minute about what are the potential impacts of a pandemic situation upon a public-private partnership. And I'm thinking here particularly about those projects that are in construction or in operation. I can think of four broad categories of issues. The first is that as a result of the pandemic, it's possible that one or the other party, or maybe both, cannot perform their obligations under the PPP contract. The second issue, and this is particularly for the private partner, is that the private partner's costs may go up as a result of the pandemic, and this may have some adverse impacts upon the project. The third possible issue is that, particularly in those projects where the private sector is levying user charges, their revenue may decrease as a result of the pandemic situation. And that again can have some significant financial impacts and affect potentially the sustainability of the project. Finally, in order to respond to the pandemic situation, the government may decide that something has to change with the project, and there are different ways that government can go about initiating changes in PPPs to respond to a situation like this. So how does that all work in terms of the contract and the risk allocation? Well, the World Bank's contractual provisions for PPPs provides us with some really good guidance on the key contractual clauses that we typically see dealing with these sorts of situations. For many of us as PPP practitioners, the first thing we think of in a situation like this is it a force majeure event? Force majeure essentially refers to circumstances in which an event occurs that is beyond the control of either party, and it prevents one or the other parties from performing all or a material part of their obligations under the contract. So the contract needs to define which events will be considered to be force majeure events for the purposes of the contract. Now, there are two approaches to doing this. The first approach is to have what we call an open-ended catch-all definition of what constitutes a force majeure. So this isn't trying to list the specific events that might be force majeures, but it's trying to describe in general terms all of those events that might fall within this concept. I would expect that under most open-ended definitions of force majeure like this, a pandemic would be regarded as a force majeure event. It is the type of event that is beyond the reasonable contemplation of the parties. It's unavoidable and it has a significant impact upon our daily life, to be honest, and therefore a significant impact upon most, if not all, public-private partnerships. This approach of having an open-ended definition of a force majeure event is more common in countries with civil law-based legal systems, and it's also more common in my experience in developing countries compared to developed countries. Here in a developed country like Australia, with a common law legal system and a very mature PPP market, we take a different approach to defining what is a force majeure event. We have a definition in the contract that lists the specific events that will be regarded as force majeure events for the purposes of the contract. So they might be events such as earthquakes and other natural disasters, war or civil unrest, and so on. Now, if I look at a sample of Australian PPP contracts, I can find pandemic included in the definition of force majeure in some, but not in many of them. So in this type of contract, the first step is to check the definition and see whether pandemic is in fact defined to be a force majeure event. Even if it is though, that doesn't finish our analysis of the issue, because much of the disruption occurring in many countries at the moment isn't directly because of the pandemic itself, but it's because of the actions governments are taking in order to respond to the pandemic. So there's an interesting question as to whether the government responses are picked up through the language in the contract and through the legal interpretation, so that they are in fact regarded as impacts of the pandemic for the purposes of the force majeure clause in the contract. Now, assuming that we've looked at our contract and we've identified that yes, under our contract, a pandemic is a force majeure event, and we've been through the initial steps to identify whether in fact the force majeure clause in the contract is activated, and that goes to things such as has the private partner or the government, if the government is calling the force majeure event, have they taken appropriate steps to mitigate the event and so on. We then come to the question of, well, what are the consequences under the contract? Typically, the consequences under the contract fall into three broad categories. Firstly, the party who is unable to comply with the contract due to the force majeure event is relieved from their obligation to perform those obligations under the contract. So if the force majeure event prevents you doing something that you're required to do under the contract, then because it is a force majeure event, you are not considered to be in default under your contract or in breach of your contract. Secondly, in most PPPs, there will be some consideration of the cost and the financial impact of the event occurring. And therefore, typically, if the private partner cannot perform their obligations under the contract, and as a result their revenue is affected, then there will be some consequence under the force majeure clause in the contract that gives them some replacement revenue. Not necessarily 100% of the revenue they've lost. Different contracts have different approaches to how it's calculated, but generally there will be an approach to providing some compensation, and the primary objective here is to really keep the project alive until the force majeure event is over and things can return to normal. So the form in which the compensation might take might be, if the PPP is a government pays PPP, government will continue making the payments under the contract, even though the private partner isn't delivering the services that the contract says it should deliver. Alternatively, and this might be the case in a user pays PPP, there may be some increase in the tariff that the private partner can charge to users as a means of providing it with additional revenue to offset revenue that might have been lost. Or alternatively, government might make a lump sum payment to the private partner. And there are other means by which governments can provide compensation. Those are just some of the key approaches. The third possible consequence that is typically provided for in PPP contracts is that if the force majeure event continues for more than a specified period often 6 months, sometimes 12 months. If that occurs, then either party can elect to terminate the contract. Usually the contract will not automatically terminate. It is up to the parties to decide whether they wish to terminate. But essentially what this does is it provides a way for the parties to bring the contract to an end if the situation, the force majeure situation, is just continuing on for an unreasonable amount of time. The parties don't want to be trapped in an arrangement that really is no longer what they originally bargained for. Now, from what we're hearing, it is quite possible that the impact of this pandemic will continue for more than 6 months, maybe even more than 12 months. So there will be a wide number of PPP contracts around the world where this possible termination event might be triggered. And no doubt government and their private partners will in the meantime be working together to try and come up with an agreed position as to what will happen as the force majeure event continues and as these force majeure termination events potentially get triggered. Force majeure isn't the only contractual concept that might be triggered by this pandemic situation in PPP projects. In some civil law countries, contracts include hardship clauses. These deal with situations where performance of the contract becomes onerous or unreasonable for a party, even though performance is not impossible. So if performance is impossible, it's dealt with by the force majeure clause. If performance is onerous but not impossible, then you would be looking at the hardship clause in these countries. The fact that governments are taking wide-ranging actions to prevent the spread of the virus and to deal with the pandemic situation also raises the prospect that various other clauses in the contract that deal with government actions might be triggered. For example, many PPP contracts, particularly in developing countries, include a concept known as materially adverse government action. This is where government does something that has an adverse impact upon the private sector's participation in the project, and in those circumstances it is reasonable for government to compensate the private sector for the consequences of those actions. The World Bank recommends that contracts that have these clauses include a defined list of what are the possible materially adverse government actions. So the responses that governments are taking to the current crisis may or may not fall within the concept of a materially adverse government action. Now, importantly, the compensation that the private partner receives as a result of a materially adverse government action is usually more than the compensation that would be received for a force majeure event. And this is based on the fact that a force majeure event is nobody's fault, and so therefore, in reality, everyone potentially loses a bit. Whereas in the case of a materially adverse government action, it is clearly government's fault that the private partner has potentially been frustrated in their performance of the contract or incurred additional costs or whatever the impact may be. And therefore the government should fully compensate the private partner. So if I was a private partner in a PPP that was affected by this pandemic and all I was concerned about was money, I would be looking in my PPP contract at whether I could claim this was a materially adverse government action rather than a force majeure event. Now, some organisations in the private sector do focus entirely on the money, but from my experience in PPPs, in situations like this, sometimes you will see private partners take a more socially responsible approach and recognise that just trying to extract the greatest compensation from government in a situation like this isn't necessarily the best approach. In some developed countries, such as Australia, we tend to not have these broad material adverse government action concepts, we have narrower categories of events that are defined as either relief events or compensation events. If they are relief events, then the private partner is granted extra time to perform their obligations under the contract, but they are not financially compensated. Whereas for compensation events, the private partner is not only allowed additional time to perform the contract, they also receive financial compensation for the financial impacts. And there is some possibility that some government actions in response to this pandemic might amount to relief events or compensation events in some PPP contracts. Another contractual provision that might be triggered in some cases is what we call a change in law. Now, PPP contracts will often provide that government should compensate the private partner for certain changes in the law. Not necessarily every change in law, because the private partner is operating a business that should be subject to business laws that may change over time and so on, just like any other business. But there will be certain categories of change in law where it is seen as appropriate for government to compensate the private partner. Some government regulations or new laws brought in response to the pandemic may possibly trigger the change in law clauses in contracts and entitle the private partner to compensation. Those are some of the key risk allocation tools that we see within PPP contracts that potentially apply in a situation such as we are in at the moment. What about though if the government decides as part of its pandemic response it actually needs some sort of change in the service required from the PPP? Now, an obvious possible example there is a hospital PPP where the private partner may have an obligation to deliver certain services, and the government wants the entire hospital to now be devoted specifically to responding to the pandemic. That may be something that isn't specifically provided for already in the contract. But even with other types of infrastructure, for example, a public transit system, government may want to change the operation of the public transit system in ways that lowers the infection risk by maybe having more services so that there is less crowding. Or perhaps if you had a PPP for some form of accommodation, whether it's a tourist facility or perhaps a barracks building for your defence force where defence personnel live, perhaps the government wants to take that over as an additional healthcare facility and quickly repurpose it so it can provide healthcare to those who've contracted the virus. So how can government go about this under the PPP contract? Well, many PPP contracts contain modification or variation clauses that allow government to request changes in the infrastructure or in the services being provided by the private partner. So that's one option. Although these clauses aren't necessarily designed for very quick and very significant changes, they are more suited to minor adjustments in the infrastructure or the services. Another option is to make use of the step-in clause in the PPP contract. Most PPP contracts will have a step-in clause which allows government to effectively take over operation and control of the infrastructure and the services in particular circumstances. Most typically those circumstances are where the private partner is in breach of the contract, and there may be various steps that have to be taken before government can step in that situation. But importantly, the other circumstance in which PPP contracts often allow government to step in is in an emergency. So it may be that under some PPP contracts, governments may in fact want to step in and take over control or management of the infrastructure in order to use it as part of their response to the pandemic. The decision to step in should not be taken lightly. While it may look like a straightforward process within the contract, in a practical sense, it is quite a challenging step to take. There is a lot of thinking through that needs to be done about how do you actually take over at short notice control and management of a significant piece of infrastructure. Most PPP contracts allow the government to step out once the need for the step in has passed. Now that sounds good in theory and it may look simple in the contract, but in reality that's probably going to be very challenging as well. Government, by stepping in and by doing a whole range of things potentially not contemplated in the contract, potentially creates a range of risks that a private partner will then be concerned about even after the emergency has passed and the private partner takes over the operation and maintenance of the facility again. So stepping in is something that should only be done if it really is the necessary solution in the circumstances. So that's a quick overview of the various provisions in a PPP contract that might be little used normally, but in this current situation with this pandemic suddenly become quite important and may be very useful in enabling public-private partnership projects to be part of the response. Thank you very much for listening and stay safe, everyone.